In this Final Fantasy limited set review, I will be evaluating every common and uncommon in the format to help you prepare for your limited events. I will be using the following card evaluation grade scale. First up are the best cards. These are cards you actively want to play and should prioritize. Next are the solid cards. These are cards you will mostly play when you are in those colors. Next are filler cards, which are cards you will sometimes play. Oftentimes they're a little bit weaker, and sometimes they only fit into one or two strategies, so you won't always need them in your deck. Those are the three main categories, but there are also build-around cards, which are cards that need certain conditions to be useful. They vary in power level, but they need a little bit of extra work in deck building. Then there are bad cards, which are not that frequent these days, but these are cards you should avoid if possible. This is the general way I advise building a sealed pool with these grading scales in mind, sorting by color and by power level grades to help you determine which colors have your highest quantity of cards in each category. So it would look something like this. Don't worry about these individual cards for now, I'll be getting to them shortly. But if you sort your pool like this, you'll be able to see, oh, I have a lot of great cards in these colors, so I should look to play those colors. The archetypes supported in Final Fantasy will help determine where each card is going to shine and where certain filler cards are going to find a home, so we're going to cover them briefly now, though the archetypes will become more clear over the course of the video as we cover individual cards that fit into particular homes. The archetypes are red-white equipment aggro, blue-black control, green-white go wide, red-blue big spells, green-black graveyard value, white-blue artifacts, red-green landfall aggro, white-black sacrifice, blue-green town ramp, and black-red spell ping aggro. There are also some mechanics that we want to cover to make sure that all of the cards are as clear as possible as we get to them. The mechanics are job select, which is a mechanic found on equipments. So when the equipment comes into play, it creates a 1/1 colorless hero creature token and then attaches the equipment to it. There is tiered, which is a way you can choose an additional cost as you're casting a spell and then get that effect. So Ice Magic, you can choose the Blizzard mode, Blizzara mode, or Blizzaga mode as you're casting Ice Magic and then spend the additional mana as required to get the particular effect. And then there is the Saga mechanic, which is attached to creatures in this set. So sagas, they come into play with a lore counter, and then they add a lore counter after each draw step, and then they sacrifice after they've gotten to their final one. But now they are creatures as well. So after, they do come in with summoning sickness, but then while they're in play, and while the saga hasn't sacrificed itself, they do function as creatures, and so that's something to note as well. With all that context out of the way, let's dive on in. First things first, we have Graha Tia, which comes into the best category. This 5-drop has decent stats as a 3/5 reach, but where it really shines is thanks to its ability, because whenever one or more other creatures and or artifacts you control die, you draw a card. And while that only triggers once each turn, it does have so many uses. If you're chump blocking with your creatures, you'll get to draw a card, so your opponent doesn't really want to attack you. If you're attacking your opponent and maybe making a chump attack, if your opponent blocks, you get to change your small creatures into new cards in hand to help you push through. And if you have like random utility artifacts that can sacrifice themselves, like treasure tokens, for example, then you just get to draw a card when you sacrifice a treasure. This is a fantastic card and one you should prioritize. Next is Delivery Moogle, a nice stat line 4-mana 3/2 flyer that's going to be able to search up an artifact from your deck. There's plenty of 2-mana artifacts thanks to the job select equipments that you're going to want to be able to search up. There's some utility artifacts, and overall a 4-mana 3/2 flyer that gets you a card from your deck that you get to search up that you'll know you'll have access to is just really nice. Next is Weapons Vendor, another 4-drop that gets you card advantage because when it comes into play, you draw a card. Its stats are a little bit small, but it does get to save you mana by letting you equip for just 1 mana, and there are a bunch of equipments in this set that have very expensive equip abilities, so Weapons Vendor does a great job with those. Next is Dragoon's Lance, a 2-mana equipment that comes into play and attaches itself to something, gives it +1/+0 and flying during your turn, so it makes your creature very hard to deal with early in the game, 2/1 flyer, and then just any of your creatures can take to the skies later, which is really nice to have as an ability because it just makes it so your opponent has to deal with the Dragoon's Lance or have a big reach creature or something like that, or else you'll just be able to turn any of your creatures into little flyers that can take them down. So a really nice equipment to have access to. Next is White Auracite. It's 4 mana for a removal spell in white. It can add some extra mana to your mana pool, but generally it's just the white removal spell at common that you're going to have to prioritize if you want to be able to interact with some premium interaction. Next, at the solid tier, we've got the Crystals Chosen. The only reason this is solid instead of great is because it does cost 7 mana, but you make 4 1/1s and then put a counter on each creature you control. If you can go wide, this card is definitely going to be in that best tier, and this is a card that can really warp the game and just win you the game on its own. Next is White Mage's Staff, 2 mana, basically for a 2/2 creature that when it attacks gains you a life and lets you move the equipment around later, just a rock solid card. Next is Adalbert Steiner. 2 mana for a 2/1 lifelink is already decent. The fact that it grows when you have equipments is definitely nice, because if you just get a 3/2 some portion of the time, or even a 4/3 of very rare cases, that's going to be a fantastic card. And so definitely a solid one, and gets better the more equipment you have. Next is Aerith Rescue Mission. 2 options with this one. You can either make 3 1/1s for 4 mana, which is a solid rate, or you can basically use this as a way to tap your opponent's creatures for a couple of turns by tapping 3 creatures and then putting a stun counter on one of them, enabling a big attack. So the optionality here is really nice, and the fact that you get to have 3 1/1s most of the time and then sometimes just win the game with this card is really nice. Next is Ambrosia Whiteheart. So it's 2 mana for a 2/2. It's got flash, so you can be a little bit tricky with this. And when it enters, you can return a permanent you control to your hand. So you can bounce lands back to your hand if you want to replay them for its landfall ability, or you can return your creatures if your opponent's going to use a kill spell on them, or maybe you have a good enters the battlefield effect. Lots of options with this card, definitely a solid one. Next is Battle Menu. So you just get all sorts of options with this one. None of them are game breaking, but the fact that you get access to all of them is really nice. You can use it to make a creature, which is a very solid default mode. You can use it as a combat trick, a kill spell, or even some life gain if you really need that, and that makes this a great card as well. Next is Coral, which is 2 mana for a 2/2, so already base stats are really nice, and then you can actually tap creatures with it, which is good as well. So in a lot of scenarios, you get into a board stall where your 2/2 might not be relevant, and all of a sudden you've got an activated ability to keep it relevant. Next is Crystal Fragment. So this is an artifact. It's an equipment, so it comes into play. Can either give something +1/+1 for 1 mana, which is reasonable, and then it can flip into a saga that can prevent all combat damage dealt to creatures you control this turn. So you can just send in with your team. Your opponent won't be able to kill them in combat. So if you're trying to finish your opponent off, it's really nice. And it's even a flyer, so it can chip in for some damage. And when it does sacrifice itself after Chapter 3, you tap all your opponent's creatures, so get it in one last big attack, which should be enough to win the game. The only reason it's not higher on the tier is because that activated ability does cost 7 mana. Next is Fate of the Suncrist. Reasonable removal spell, usually going to be cast for 3 mana to kill a tapped creature, but the fact that you can kill any non-land permanent for 5 mana at instant speed is nice. Next is Magitech Armor, 4 mana for a 4/4 vehicle. It does come with the creature that it needs in order to crew it, so that makes it a really nice card, because if you trade off with the Magitech Armor, you're left with a 1/1, so you're up a little bit of resources. Definitely a nice card. Next is Ash, Princess of Dalmasca. So it's a 3 mana 3/2, so not the greatest stat line, and it's often not going to survive combat. But when it does attack, you can oftentimes find an artifact from your deck. And the only reason this isn't in the best category is because some decks aren't going to have as many artifacts. And so if you do whiff with that, it's just a 3 mana 3/2, or if you don't have enough artifacts. But generally, this card is going to be quite good. And when you're able to attack with it multiple times, you're going to be able to take over the game. Next is Restoration Magic, so a very flexible tiered card. You can use it as a 1 mana combat trick, a 2 mana combat trick, or you can use it as a 5 mana trick that protects your whole team. So that's nice options to have on a trick. Next is Side Quest, Catch a Fish. So this card's a little bit slow, a little bit finicky, but it does pay you off. You get a 3 mana enchantment, and then eventually you're going to draw a creature or artifact from it and flip it into Cooking Campsite, which is a land. So you basically drew a card and made a land, which is nice, especially if you can flip it relatively quickly in the first couple of tries. And then you can sacrifice artifacts to put counters on each of your creatures, which is nice, especially because it spots you a food token when it flips, so that lets you buff your entire team if you need to. Next is Slash of Light, so 2 mana, instant speed, you deal damage equal to the number of creatures, plus the number of equipments you control, so just a pretty reasonable combat trick, especially if you have some equipments and creatures in your deck. It doesn't always do what you want it to do, so you should prioritize having some equipment or creatures that make equipments, like these Job Select cards to get 2 things for 1, or cards to make multiple bodies, or things like that, so that you can make Slash of Light more effective in your deck, but it can oftentimes get the job done. Next is Summon Primal Garuda, so 4 mana, the Chapter 1 mode is going to kill something, so even though the saga will sacrifice itself, you're not going to be down a card, which is really important with these sagas, and then it's going to help your creatures take to the skies, and it's a flyer itself, so it can pressure your opponent, or just sit back and make it so your opponent doesn't want to trade for a turn or 2. Next is Zac Fair, so 1 mana for a 0/1, but he comes with a counter, so he's a 1 mana 1/2, and then you can use his ability to sacrifice him and protect one of your creatures, giving it indestructible, giving it any equipments that are on Zac Fair, and it's +1/+1 counter, so that's a pretty nice option to have with your 1-drop. Moving on to another solid card, we've got Dwarven Castle Guard, 2 mana 2/1, and then it dies into a 1/1, wears equipments pretty well, leaves another body that can wear equipments, and overall it's just that sort of reasonable 2-drop you put into your deck in a lot of cases. Moving on to some filler cards, we've got Summon Choco/Mog, so it's 3 mana for a 3/3, but the reason it's not in the solid category is because eventually it's going to sacrifice itself, so if you play this on turn 3, you're not really going to be able to maximize it, and a lot of the time you want your 3-drops to be playable on turn 3, though if you have plenty of creature tokens or ways to go wide, Also, being able to make this card in the late game to be able to just buff all of your creatures can be quite nice. It's just something you need to be aware of, that this card isn't really the ideal turn 3 play, and so that does make it a little bit weaker in a lot of cases. Next is Cloudbound Moogle, so just not the greatest stats. Plane Cycling gives it a little flexibility, but 5 mana for 3/4 worth of stats just isn't great. Next is Galliket. It's 2 mana white for a 1/3 with flying and vigilance, so not the greatest stat line. If you have artifacts in your deck, it moves up in power level. It's not quite a build around because you can just certainly include it in your just normal decks if you just only have a couple artifacts, but in an artifacts deck, it can definitely be one of your better cards. It's just more filler in most of the archetypes. Next is Magitech Infantry, so 1 mana for a 1/1. It gets buffed if you have artifacts, and then it can have you search for other Magitech Infantry. This card's a little bit hard to use. It definitely really fits into the artifact deck, and that's why it's counting as filler, because in other decks, you're not going to really be able to use it as well. It does play well with the red-white equipments a little bit, and it does help you go wide a little bit for green-white if you have multiple copies of it, but having to prioritize taking multiple copies does provide a little bit of tension in the draft portion, and the card isn't that good, and so it is mostly just a filler card. Next is Paladin's Arms, so 3 mana, and you basically get a 3/2 with Ward 1, and then it can be equipped later for 4 mana. That's one of the things I mentioned with these expensive equip abilities that makes some of the other cards that let you equip for just 1 mana pretty nice. And so the Paladin's Arms is just a reasonable card. 3 mana, 3/2, not the greatest stat line, but the fact that you can then move it around later is nice. Looking next at You're Not Alone, so just 1 mana, +2/+2. Later in the game, it's often going to be +4/+4. It's nice to have as an option, but you don't really need to prioritize combat tricks. Next is Snow Villiers. It's 2 and a white for a *3, and so it's got vigilance, and its power is equal to the number of creatures you control. So if you have a lot of creatures, it can be a bigger creature, but the fact that its toughness is always 3 means it's often going to trade with other 3-drops regardless of what you do, and it doesn't really take over the game on its own, so it's not a crazy card. Next is Phoenix Down, so it's an artifact that has generally going to be returning a creature with mana value 4 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So you invest 3 mana, hopefully get back a 4-drop, but it's finicky. You have to get the creature into your graveyard, and it's oftentimes not going to do exactly what you want. And then there's not that many skeleton spirits and zombies, and so just as a general rule, this card is a little bit weaker, though you can include it in your deck, especially with some artifact synergies. And then we have the build around card, Auron's Inspiration. If you are playing a go wide deck, this can be one of the best cards in your deck. But if you only have a few creatures, or you're just relying on 1 or 2 big creatures, or you're not really aggressive, you're not really attacking a lot, this card is going to be kind of a blank. So it really does have a mileage will vary type effect. But if you build around it, it can be quite good. Moving on to blue, starting off with the best cards once again, we have Dragoon's Wyvern, so 2 and a blue for a 2/1 flyer. Isn't the best, but it comes with a 1/1 creature, which makes all the difference, making this a great card to include 2 bodies, 1 card, and some evasion tacked on. Next is Ilmeg Pixie, so 2 mana, 2/1 flyer. When it attacks, you surveil 1. You can fill your graveyard, you can find the spells you want. Really great card to play on turn 2, and even in the later stages of the game, that surveil stays relevant, and flying is always nice. Next is Sleep Magic, very efficient removal spell. If the creature is dealt damage, you do lose the Sleep Magic, but generally the creature's going to be locked down for just 1 mana. It's very efficient and a great removal spell. Next is Stuck in Summoner's Sanctum, so 2 and a blue for a flash removal spell in blue. At common, it's just a really good card to prioritize because you're going to need interaction, and being able to tap your opponent's creatures down and kind of get rid of them for a while is really nice. It will prevent activated abilities, but if it does have passive abilities, those will stick around, so keep that in mind. Next is Ultros. We're moving to the solid cards. Ultros, Obnoxious Octopus, so it's 2 mana for a 2/1. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, if at least 4 mana was spent to cast it, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. So we'll be referring to those as big spells because that's kind of what the blue-red deck is doing, these 4 mana or more non-creature spells. So when you cast a big spell, you get to tap their creature and put a stun counter on it, which is fantastic. And if you cast a massive spell, 8 mana, it gets 8 counters, which isn't going to be that common, but if it does happen, you're going to be very happy with your Ultros. And so generally, it's going to be a 2 mana 2/1 that taps things, which is definitely a solid card. Next is Ice Magic. So we already talked about this card in the mechanics a little bit. This card is definitely just solid. Lots of options. All of them are pretty reasonable, except for Blizzaga, randomly going to cost you 8 mana. I guess it's a combo with the Ultros if you want to do that if you get to the late game, but generally just going to be using that Blizzard or Blizzara mode and be pretty happy with it. Next is Cargo Ship, so 2 mana for a 2/3. It is a vehicle, so you're going to have to crew it if you want it to be a creature, but it's got flying, vigilance. You can tap it for mana to cast your artifacts or activate abilities of artifacts, and generally the crew 1 means it's pretty easy to activate, especially with random hero tokens running around. Next is Eject, so that's a big spell for cards that care about that. It draws you a card to replace itself, and it gets to return something to its owner's hand at instant speed, and so that's going to be nice flexibility, nice power level, and good synergy. Next is Quistis Trepe. It's 2 and blue for a 2/2. When it enters, you can cast an instant or sorcery from any graveyard, so your graveyard or your opponent's graveyard, and spend mana of any type to cast it. So it's more of a late game 3-drop, but it's very powerful when it works out. It just does require you to get to the late game and have some spells you want to cast probably, and so it is, instead of being a crazy good, it's not like a card that you can always be using effectively in the early turns, and so that's why it's more just solid instead of in the best tier, though it is a great card in late game scenarios. Next is a Rook Turret, so 4 mana for a 3/3 flyer. When you have an artifact enter, you draw a card, and if you do, you discard a card. So just nice card filtering. An artifact, it's flying, just a nice little card. Next is Summon Shiva, so another one of these saga creatures. You get to tap down your opponent's creatures with stun counters for a couple turns. You have a 4/5 body, and then you eventually get to draw some cards. So just a really solid body. Next is Combat Tutorial. It's card draw, but you also put a counter on a creature, which does make a big difference. So if you can go 2-drop into this, you can maybe be more defensive to actually make use of those cards, or in the late game, you just really like having card draw anyway, and the extra counter definitely does make an impact with this sort of thing. Combat stats attached to card advantage is nice. Next is Swallowed by Leviathan. So it's a counter spell that also gets you Surveil too, and a lot of the time you're going to have a full graveyard by the mid to late game, so you'll be able to counter whatever you want, while also getting some card selection, making it a solid counter spell. Next is Syncopate, another solid counterspell. It scales with the game because of that X mana, and having things get exiled instead of going to the graveyard can certainly be relevant. Next up is Thief's Knife. This card is a little bit finicky because it's just a 3 mana 2/2, but it does put a lot of pressure on the game and really kind of forces your opponent to deal with it, because if they don't have a blocker available, you can just start hitting them, drawing cards, taking over the game. If you have a flyer to equip it to, it's really nice as well. And so Thief's Knife, while expensive, can definitely be a game warping card. Next up are some filler cards, Quickheron Merchant. So it's 3 mana for a 1/4, which isn't the greatest stats. It lets you loot if you pay some mana into it. Eventually you can sack it to draw 3 cards. If you have towns, it does get a little bit better, but generally it's a very defensive card, so not every deck's going to be super interested, though in the late game town ramp decks, the card is going to get better because you want to loot away your lands to find your expensive cards, and being eventually able to sacrifice it to draw 3 is definitely nice. Next is Dreams of Laguna, so 2 mana, Surveil 1, draw a card. Not the greatest card. It has Flashback though, which will count as a big spell, which is also super nice. And so this card's more of a filler card because it fits into specific archetypes versus being a weak card. It fits into that blue-red spells deck pretty nicely and helps you find what you need and eventually be a little bit of a spell payoff, or spell enabler, but it's not the craziest card just on terms of its raw stats. Next is Ice Flan. So it's 6 mana for a 5/4, just not the greatest stats, even though it does tap something and put a stun counter on it. The island cycling's nice, but it's just a little bit weak. Next is Magic Damper. So a reasonable combat trick, but nothing crazy you'll need to prioritize. Then the Prima Vista. So 5 mana for a 5/3 flyer is big, and when you cast a non-creature, like a big spell, then it'll become an artifact creature without having to crew it. But just the fact that it's a 5 mana play that won't affect the board immediately means it's going to be a pretty big downside in the situations where you just need a big body to block with or things like that. And so it is a little bit more niche than some of the other 5-drops you can play. Next is Realms Sketching, another card that's going to be very board state dependent on whether there's something worth copying, artifact, creatures, land. So if you get to a board state where there's like a big 6-drop in play, you get to copy it for 4 mana, that's nice, but in the early turns it's a bit of a blank, so it's a bit of a more niche card. Next is Retrieve the Esper. This is another card that's going to be much more at home in the big spells deck because it's a 4 mana spell that's going to make you a creature. So it kind of impacts the board state, which is something that a spells deck can struggle with, while also being an enabler for that deck, though it at the same time isn't the biggest creature. So 4 mana for a 3/3 isn't the greatest. So you want to have other payoffs working with this card in order to want it, which is why it goes into that filler tier. Next is Sage's Noodliths. So it's 2 mana for basically a 2/1 that can give something vigilance or untap another creature. It's not the greatest stat line, and its equipment cost is pretty high, and it doesn't even give the most stats, so that's why it's filler. Next is Sahagin. So it's when you cast a big spell, you get a counter on it and can't be blocked, so it fits into that archetype very narrowly. It doesn't really fit into the other decks very well. Next is Scorpion Sentinel. Again, kind of a card that fits more into the late game ramp decks because getting to 7 or more lands is kind of a big commitment. It doesn't happen all that often, and a 2 mana 1/4 isn't going to be the greatest. But if you are playing a ramp deck that goes for extra lands, then this card can definitely be a 2-drop you're happy to play because getting a 4/4 for 2 mana in the late game is really nice. It can buy you time and then be good, but it's not the card that you want to just be playing in every blue deck necessarily, unless you're being a slow deck. It kind of fits into the artifacts deck by being an artifact, fits into the ramp decks, but it's not really a card for necessarily the blue-red spell deck. Big spell deck, or things like that. So you need to be careful where you're including it, but it can definitely be a nice addition. Next is Side Quest Card Collection. So it's a draw 3, discard 2, so not the greatest effect for 4 mana, but if you do fill your graveyard, you get a pretty nice vehicle. So easy to crew 4/4 vehicle, so it's going to be more of a niche card for those slower decks. It's not really going to be finding a home in more tempo-y decks that are, because 4 mana, draw 3, discard 2 isn't the greatest, and you're going to want to have some other support that helps you fill your graveyard. Next is Travel the Overworld. This is a build around card, but it is super powerful. You don't need to have that many towns before you're happy playing this. You just wouldn't be that happy with 7 mana draw 4 because 7 mana is such a high amount of mana. But if you have some ramp in your deck, if you have a good number of towns in your deck, like 3 or 4 towns to make this cost 5 or 6 mana by the time you get to the late game, then Travel the Overworld is going to be fantastic and definitely a card to prioritize. Next is Ether. 4 mana, you're going to want to have some big spells in your deck, and I mean big spells. So you want to be able to use this to cast like 6 mana spells, things like that, because copying them is nice, but you have to invest 4 mana up front and like not spend turn 4 not doing anything, and so you're going to want to have a lot of really high impact spells when you're going to put Ether in your deck. Next is Valkyrie Aerial Unit. With a few artifacts, this card becomes quite strong. 7 mana for a 5/4 that surveils 2 isn't the best, but if you're doing this for 5 mana, it becomes excellent, and so just kind of keep that in mind when you are putting this card in your deck. If you have a few artifacts, you'll want it. Moving on to a bad card, Stolen Uniform. Just don't include this card in your deck. You get to take an equipment temporarily, but that's just not a good effect. Moving on to black. First, we're going to talk about the best cards once again. Overkill, 2 in a black, kill a creature pretty much. If they have a creature with 1,000 toughness, you've got bigger problems than Overkill not being active. And so you should be able to just kill whatever you want, and you're going to be happy with that at instant speed. Next up is another kill spell, Side Quest Hunt the Mark. So it's more expensive at 5 mana, and it's an enchantment. But when you kill something, you start getting treasure tokens. And if you kill enough things, or things trade off in combat, it doesn't have to be used doing just removal spells. You eventually flip into Yasmat Ultimate Mark, which is just fantastic as a card, and it's probably going to win you the game as just a giant dragon. You'll have some treasure tokens because you've been able to flip it, so you'll have the ability to sacrifice it to give it indestructible, and so that's just going to be a game-winning card. Next is Vane's Treachery. So 2 mana, you can kill a small thing, or you can sacrifice something to kill something bigger. Just a really nice flexible instant speed removal spell. There is Sephiroth's Intervention, which is, compared to some of the removal spells we've just looked at, isn't as fantastic, but it's still a really good removal spell. You kill a creature at instant speed, and the life gain means that even if you kill something smaller, so you're down a little bit on tempo, you gain back some of that life, which is going to be really helpful. Next is Summon Anima, so 6 mana for a 4/4 menace. It has a lot of time on it because it's got 4 chapters instead of just 3, and you're drawing a lot of cards. So you'll draw 3 cards from this and then make your opponent sacrifice a creature, all while having a 4/4 that impacts the board state and can attack them or just block and trade off if you can't afford to wait through all the chapters. And that's just a really good card to have access to at the top end of your curve. Next is The Final Day. So 4 mana, you get a couple of 2/2s, even though they come into play tapped. And then eventually you flash it back from a graveyard and you get to make a bunch of 2/2s, which can just take over the game in the late game. If you have like 4 or 5 creatures in your deck, you're just adding insane amounts of power to the board and toughness to the board. And even though they come into play tapped, it's still just a fantastic card. Next is Shambling Sieth. So 3 mana for a 3/3. It enters tapped, but when you cast non-creature spells, you get to bring it back from your graveyard to the hand by just paying 1 black mana. So in the late game, you're just going to have a 3/3 that your opponent's going to really struggle to deal with anytime you play a non-creature spell, and that's a really nice thing to have available. Next is the solid cards, Ahriman. So 2 in a black for a 2/2, Flying Death Touch is already just solid, and then the sacrifice ability is just gravy, going to fit especially nicely into that white-black deck that cares about sacrificing things. Next is another card that's great in a sacrifice deck, the Al-Bhed Salvagers. Again, 3 mana for a 2/3 that has this text of whenever a creature or artifact you control dies, an opponent loses a life and you gain a life. It's just nice to have. So it's going to cause your opponent some problems. They're going to have to deal with it a lot of the time. If you have like treasure tokens or a bunch of 1/1 creatures or some sacrifice engine set up, your opponent's going to be losing a lot of life. You're going to be gaining a lot of life, finding a lot of extra time to find your other synergy pieces. Next is Black Mage's Rod. So a really good 2-drop for that black-red spell ping aggro deck. It makes a 2/1 creature, and then when you cast a non-creature spell, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. And because it's an equipment, if that creature eventually dies, you can move that effect onto another creature, and so you constantly have that ping ability available to use. Next is Dark Knight's Greatsword, so 2 in a black for basically a 4/1 creature that can then let you move that equipment around by just paying 3 life. So if you're in an aggressive deck, this card is going to be stellar because you don't care about your own life total as much, and any of your creatures can become a formidable threat. It's not as good in the more defensive decks, and so that's why it's not going to be in the best category, but it is still really, really good if you're trying to be aggressive. Next is Demon Wall. So a really nice defensive card because the 2 mana 3/3 that eventually, when you get to 6 mana, can turn into a 5/5 menace attacker. And so that's really nice to have in your more defensive decks, not as good in your aggressive decks, which is why it does once again move into the solid category instead of the best category, because not every deck's going to care about it as much, but the decks that do really want this card are going to love having it. Next is Gaius von Belsar. So 4 mana for a 3/2 with a pretty neat effect. So you could have each player sacrifice a creature token, each player sacrifice a non-creature token, or each player sacrifice an enchantment. And so if you don't have one of those, like if you don't have any enchantments and your opponent has an enchantment, you get a nice little value play. And you can always just make them sacrifice a token. If neither of you has a token, you just have a 4 mana 3/2 if you need it. But a lot of the time you can use this to like sacrifice a bad creature that you have and make them sacrifice a good creature. The optionality on this card really does propel it to being a solid one. Next is Tonberry. So it comes into play with a stun counter. So it's not going to untap on the first turn that you get it, but then it has first strike and death touch on your turn, which is basically meaning it's unblockable almost. Like they can chump block it, but first strike and death touch means that it's going to be able to deal the damage and have death touch. So no creature, no matter what its toughness, it's going to die to the Tonberry. And so Tonberry is going to be able to do a lot of damage to your opponent. They're not going to want to chump block it, and it only costs 1 mana. So very low investment for a very strong card. It's not the best defensive option, but it's still a really good one to have available. Next is Reno and Rude. So 2 mana, 2/1 menace. So nice little aggressive threat. And when you deal combat damage, you can look at their exile the top card of their library, and you can potentially cast it if you have an expendable creature and the spell is particularly good. So really good upside to have on your creature. Next is Hecdize. So just classic effect. You make your opponent discard a card. You can use this in the early turns to maybe just make them like feel annoyed and have them maybe discard lands that they maybe want to keep or things like that. Or you can save it until your opponent has like only a couple cards in hand that you're pretty sure are pretty good spells, and then just nab one of their good spells. And so it's just a lot of flexibility, really solid 2-drop. You're happy to play, and because it got some value when it comes in, if you sacrifice it to something, you're also happy. Next is Marlborough. So a kind of much bigger effect of the Hecdize. So 6 mana 4/4, they discard a card, lose 2 life, exile the top 3 cards of their library. So having this onto a late game play also means you can kind of nab your opponent's last spell sometimes. It is going to mean because both these cards are commons in the format, you should be holding an extra land if you have a premium spell to protect if you're against a black deck. Just keep that in mind. And the Swamp Cycling is a nice upside on this as well. Next is Fang, Fearless Lycier. So it's 3 mana for a 2/3. When a card leaves your graveyard, you draw a card and lose a life. That's already a solid card. And if you're combining it with the green half of the card, you can get a meld combo going. We'll cover the green card in the green section, but you can flip this into Ragnarok Divine Deliverance potentially, which is just a 7/6 Vigilance, Menace, Trample, Reach, Haste that has extra upside as well. So the fact that you can potentially meld it is nice, but just evaluate this card on its base as, okay, 3 mana for a 2/3 that's going to get me some card advantage. That's already a solid card. And some of the cards that you can use with it are something like Fight On, so returning creatures from your graveyard to your hand will trigger the Fang and things like that. So this is a reasonable card, but you can't use it for card advantage until the late game when you've already filled your graveyard, which is why it's a filler card. There's also a card like Evil Reawakened, which you can bring back a premium threat from your graveyard to the battlefield with a couple of counters, but it is going to be finicky to set up. You might not always have something really big. Though if you do land cycle a card into your graveyard and then bring it back, that can be a way to use this on turn 5 to get back something pretty reasonably sized, like a Marlborough or whatever. Then there's Undercity Dire Rat, just reasonable 2 mana 2/2 that dies into a treasure. Totally solid card. You'll be fine playing it. It fits a little bit better in sacrifice decks where the treasure can be sacrificed and the rat can be sacrificed, but definitely a filler card. You'll be pretty reasonable to happy playing it. There's Namazu Traders, so a 4 mana 3/4 that comes into play and makes a treasure. That gives you something to sacrifice. You can also attack, sacrifice that treasure token or another creature or artifact, and if you do, you Surveil too, so set up your draws. Totally reasonable card. It's just not always going to fit into your strategy that you're building, which is why it's once again in the filler category. Then there is Vincent's Limit Break, so just a combat trick in black. Totally reasonable to play, but combat tricks are generally filler because they're not going to be priorities for you because you don't always need combat tricks. Then there's Shinra Reinforcements, 3 mana 2/3, gains you some life, fills your graveyard, but just, again, not a crazy stat line. Resentful Revelation gets you some cards. You can look at the top 3, 1 in your hand, rest your graveyard. Helps you fill your graveyard. You can flash it back later to get some extra value, but again, it's a sorcery speed way to like dig through cards. It's just not going to be a huge priority. And then there's Q-Trub Forayer. So when you're it lets you enable your attack. So if you're attacking with small creatures, you can kill creatures that have been dealt damage. Your opponent's like bigger blockers. You can potentially remove cards from their graveyard if they have some of those synergies, but just not a crazy good card. Just 3 mana 3/2. Not going to be a high priority. Then there's some build around cards that we're looking at. Circle of Power. So 4 mana, you get to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, which isn't a great rate, but you also make one of these black wizard creature tokens, which are able to ping your opponent, which are definitely going to be valuable if you can get multiples of them. And giving your wizards +1/+0 and lifelink is pretty interesting because if you're playing a black-red deck that's filled with these little wizards, then eventually you can like play a Circle of Power, maybe cast one other spell that turn to have all of your wizards ping your opponent. They'll gain lifelink, so you'll gain some life, and then you can attack them with all these 0/1s that are now 1/1s, which can potentially be a game-swinging play. So keep that in mind for your wizards black-red ping decks. Then there is Cornered by Black Mages, which is a really hard card to cast. So it's 1 black, which is hard to cast. There are tokens in this set. There's all these job select cards. There's these wizard tokens. There's a bunch of cards that make a token. And so if your opponent gets to sacrifice a creature of their choice, they're going to often be able to sacrifice something irrelevant, though you do make a 0/1 black wizard. So if you're really all in on the black-red wizard spell deck, then you could potentially try to play this. It's just generally a very weak card because 1 black is kind of hard to cast. It's a lot of mana, and it's going to be hard. There are a lot of tokens in this set, so just keep that in mind. There's an entire green-white archetype where this is going to make them sacrifice a 1/1 most of the time, and so just keep that in mind. It's not a card you're going to want to play most of the time. There's also Phantom Train. So in a dedicated sacrifice deck, you could maybe consider this, but again, it's really hard to want to include this card because it just is really hard to enable. You have to have a constant stream of artifacts and creatures to feed the train, and generally that's going to be hard to do, and you're going to struggle to be able to use this outside of very, very focused sacrifice decks because you want to be able to attack with your creatures and block with your creatures, and the fact that you always have to put an artifact or creature into this, there's not an alternate crew cost like crew 4 even or something like that. The fact you always have to sacrifice something is a big deal. Next is Poison the Waters. This card is really mostly just a sideboard card against a deck that's trying to go wide. The -1/-1 is kind of good against some decks, kind of bad against other decks, and so that's just really kind of a niche effect. And the making them reveal their hand, the artifact or creature is not quite enough flexibility. If you could take any card, that'd be much better, but this is generally just a weak effect. Maybe you could count it as filler, but I would advise against playing this one outside of sideboard scenarios. Next is red. We've got back to the best category, moving on to some great cards. We've got Thunder Magic. So this has great options with its tiered mode. You can do 1 mana to deal 2 to a creature, 4 mana to deal 4 to a creature, or you can spend 7 mana to deal 8 to a creature. So generally those first two modes, Thunder and Thundara, are going to be the best modes, and that flexibility, usually you get a cheap removal spell in red and a mid-range removal spell in red, and the fact that this does both in one card is fantastic, at instant speed even. Then there is Suplex, so 2 mana, deal 3 to a creature, or you can exile an artifact. Usually 2 mana, deal 3 at sorcery speed, just a nice little solid removal spell. Then there's Choco Comet, so X red, you can kill a creature, you can deal X damage to a target, and that can include players. So you can use this to finish off your opponent, and you make a bird token. So even if you don't kill the thing, you can make a bird. So you could use this potentially as a 2 mana 2/2 bird if you really wanted to. If you didn't want to kill anything on turn 2, you can just choose to deal 0 damage to any target. But the fact that you can use this on like turn 5 to kill a 3/3 and make a bird is really nice as an option. So this is a really strong, powerful effect. Then there's Samurai's Katana, so 3 mana for basically a 3/3 trampler with haste. This high equipability is why some of the cards we looked, the one white card we looked at earlier, that Common the Weapons Vendor guy, why the ability to equip for just 1 mana is really nice with that card, because there's a card like Samurai's Katana with equip 5, which is really high, and so you're generally going to be using that only in the late game when you've already exhausted all of your spells. But generally 3 mana 3/3 trample haste is good enough that you don't really care about that. And the fact that you have the upside is still really nice. Next is Sabo Tender. So 2 mana for a 2/1 with reach. The reach is always something to be aware of in these random red cards. And landfall, when a land enters, you deal 1 damage to each opponent. So you play this on turn 2, your opponent's going to be taking like 3 or 4 damage from it just over the course of the game from your land drops. And if it chips in for 2 damage on its own, that's really formidable. And so if you can get multiple of these in play, or really just play this card and just wait, then your opponent's going to be in trouble and probably have to deal with it. So Sabo Tender is a nice little 2-drop for your deck. Next is Fire Magic. So a really flexible tiered spell. You can deal 1 to each creature, you can deal 2 to each creature, you can deal 3 to each creature. The fact that you have this flexibility at instant speed means you can set up some really devastating things where your opponent attacks you and you set up a block where you can like deal 1 damage to a couple of different creatures and then like wipe the board or things like that. And the fact that you know it's coming means that you can do something like set up the board with all of your 4 toughness creatures, or just make sure you have a bunch of 3 toughness creatures in play before you deal 2 to everything. And I think the flexibility of this card really does make it a solid one to include. Next is Queen Brawn. So 2 in a red for a 2/1 prowess and makes one of these wizard pingers. So definitely a nice card in that black-red deck, or even just a deck that is playing more of a spells theme, like the blue-red deck maybe, and gets that 0/1 as extra damage / a chump blocker potentially down the road. Next is Blazing Bomb. So a nice little 1-drop for the big spells deck. It can grow over time, eventually sacrifice itself to kill a creature. There is Prompto Argentum, so you get a 2 mana 2/2 haste, a nice little aggressive threat, and when you cast a big spell, you're going to make a treasure. So that's going to help you cast more big spells in the future, and also just be a nice little upside on the Argentum. Then there's Haste Magic, so this is going to be a combat trick that lets you turn those random 1/1s or those random 0/1 wizards into like an effect that can trade in combat. So you get +3/+1, exile the top card, you can play it until your next end step. So if you use this on your opponent's turn, you'll have your entire turn to play that card, and because it says play, you can play lands with it. Then there's Sandworm, so just a big haster, and it can double trigger your landfall. So you play a land, trigger landfall, play Sandworm, attack, destroy your own land, get another land, trigger your landfall twice, turn all of your Chocobirds into 4/2s, which is just really nice to have access to. I guess they're called Chocobos, so yeah, pretty cool card and really nice for those landfall aggro decks. Next is Side Quest Play Blitzball. So it's a 3-mana play that can buff up your creatures and just make any of your creatures kind of a reasonably sized attacker. And if you eventually deal 6 damage to an opponent, which isn't going to happen that much, because when you're dealing 6 damage to your opponent, you're often winning the game, you can flip it into World Champion Celestial Weapon, and then you just have a giant equipment that can just give something +2/+0 and double strike, which is just crazy. And it's got a giant Beyblade in the art, which is hilarious. Next is Barrett Wallace. So it's a card that cares about having equipped creatures. So it's a 4-mana 4/4 reach, already solid. Remember that reach. And then when it deals damage to it attacks, it can just deal some extra damage to your opponent. So it's just a nice attacker in your equipment deck. Then there's Warrior Sword, 4-mana 4/3 basically. Expensive equip cost, but still nice upside to have on your equipment. And then there's Light of Judgment. So a removal spell that can kill an equipment attached to a creature, definitely good to be aware of because there are a lot of these job select equipments running around. So it makes it a little bit nicer. Then there is Hill Gigas. So it's a giant trampler with haste. It does cost 6 mana, but it has mountain cycling as a buyout clause. And the fact that it gets to impact the board immediately when it comes down for 6 mana is definitely nice. Moving on to a filler card, Freya Crescent, definitely more of a card for the equipment deck. If you're using this as a mana dork for your equipments, you're going to be really happy having this card. But in other decks without equipments, you're not going to really want this card at all because just a 1-mana 1/1 flyer is just a little bit small ball for this era of limited. There is Mysidian Elder, so a card maybe for the black-red aggro deck because it does make one of these pinging wizards, but a 1/3 into a 0/1 is not the greatest stat line unless you're really building around it. Then there is Summon GF Ifrit, so it's 3 mana for a 3/2, but it will eventually destroy itself. And so the fact that you don't really necessarily want to play this on turn 3 does make it a bit more of a liability, though the ramp can be kind of nice for ramping things out. It's just the fact that you're kind of putting yourself down a card in the early turns when you play this, and then you only get like 2 turns of attacking out of it before it sacrifices itself is definitely worth keeping in mind. There is Call the Mountain Chocobo, which is a card for the big spells deck or the landfall deck. Those are kind of the places you'll want it. If you're in the big spells deck, you can cast this on turn 4 to trigger a big spell, and then cast it again on turn 6 to trigger a big spell. Hitting your land drops is very important in that sort of deck, and hitting your land drop is also important in your landfall decks. And so this kind of card has a more niche home. It doesn't really fit into red-white decks at all, or black, but in black-red decks, maybe you care about having more non-creature spells and things like that. It's just generally one of those cards that's not going to be a huge priority, but can definitely slot into some decks and have some nice synergy. Then there is Item Shopkeep, a card for the equipment decks, really. A 2-mana 2/2 that doesn't have any upside, wouldn't really be worth playing, but if you have equipped creatures gaining menace, that can definitely be nice. Then there is Opera Love Song, a card that can either be a little bit of card advantage. Again, you can only play them until your next end step, so you have to really time this properly. Like cast this on your opponent's end step, give yourself a whole turn cycle to know what you want to play. Or you can use this as a bit of a combat trick, though the fact that it doesn't buff toughness does mean it is a bit weaker as a combat trick, so just keep that in mind. Next, there's Coral Sword. So this can be a combat trick / just equipment payoff. You flash this in, give a creature first strike until end of turn, and then you just have a cheap equipment to move around. It can definitely win you some combats, but +1/+0 and first strike isn't the craziest stat combo. And the fact that it's just +1/+0 doesn't make it a crazy card. It's just overall a nice little option to have in your equipment decks. Again, combat tricks are not a huge priority. Next is Laughing Mad. This card was almost in the bad tier. 3 mana for this effect is really expensive. It's just the fact that you can use this multiple times does let you trigger your spell effects twice in your black-red decks, and does count as a big spell for your blue-red decks when you're flashing it back, but generally not a card you want to prioritize. I almost did put this in the bad tier. It's just quite inefficient on the front side, and even the flashback cost doesn't really fully redeem the card. It's just a card that you can potentially find some uses for in your decks. Then there's Build Around, Red Mage's Rapier. If you're building a deck that casts a lot of non-creature spells, specifically that black-red deck, then the fact that you can maybe have your creature get buffed multiple times in one turn your 2-drop into like hitting your opponent for like 4 or 5 damage, like getting +4/+0 or something like that could definitely be relevant. But if you don't have a lot of non-creature spells, it's not going to really do much for you. Then there's another build around, the Summon Esperama. So 4 mana for a 3/3, you deal damage equal to the number of non-creature, non-land cards in your graveyard. So you're going to want to have a lot of instants and sorceries in your deck and be able to fill that graveyard, potentially to use this to kill your opponent's creature. And then buffing up your wizards isn't going to be crazy impactful. It does buff itself, so it'll attack as a 4/3 on that second turn, and then buff your other, like maybe your little 0/1 wizards will become 1/1s, but generally you're going to want to use this as a removal spell in your deck. And then there's Sorceress's Scheme, so you can use this to buy back instants and sorceries. So if you have a lot of high impact instants and sorceries, if this is going to trigger your big spell payoffs, you can use it, but generally not going to be a high priority index that don't have lots of instants and sorceries to choose from. Then there's Unexpected Request, so this is perfect in a black-red deck that has some sacrifice cards in black or red, so you can steal your opponent's creature, attack them with it, and then you can sacrifice that creature. So if you can play this in a black-red deck, you'll be pretty happy to have that combo available. Then there is self-destruct. So if you have a lot of high toughness, low power creatures, this can be potentially useful because your creature deals X damage to itself. But if it's like a 3/5 creature, then it'll deal 3 damage to itself and it'll survive. You don't want this in your deck if you have a lot of symmetrical creatures like 3/3s that'll kill themselves, things like that. So just make sure your self-destruct has like 3/5s or 2/4s or things like that. But generally a card you should avoid because most cards are symmetrical or will have more power than toughness. Next is bad card, random encounter. So 6 mana, you mill 4 after shuffling, and then you can put creatures into play. It's just not a card it is worth playing. Even with the giant flashback cost, you're not going to be getting enough power reliably to make this worth it. Just avoid this card. It's not good. Next is green. At first up, there's Chocobo Racetrack. So it's 5 mana, and then it has a landfall. You make a 2/2 bird. So if you can have a deck that's built around landfall, has some ramp in it potentially, just every time you play a land, making a 2/2 is pretty strong. And so even though this does cost 5 mana and won't immediately impact the game, if you build around this card even a little bit, or you just like save your lands, knowing that you'll draw this eventually, that's a pretty powerful effect to have. By eventually, like, you're in a board stall with your opponent, but every land you draw, you get a 2/2. That's a pretty good card. Maybe a little bit aggressive. Maybe this is more of a solid card because it only fits well into some of the archetypes. But generally, green decks tend to have some ramp, tend to go into the late game a little bit more, and this card's really good in those situations. Next is Chocobo Kick. So you get to have the kicker of return a land to your hand. So you can re-trigger landfall, which is really nice, and your creatures are going to deal damage to an opponent's creature, and if it's kicked, your creature deals twice as much. So a really nice common removal spell, even if it is a sorcery. Then there's Gazal Green, so make a Chocobo Bird, and then you can flash it back to make another Chocobo Bird, so really nice to have as a 2-drop / late game play. There is Summon Fenrir, so we already looked at this card a little bit, but you get a basic land, and the next turn, your next creature gets a little bit bigger, and then you get to draw a card if you have the biggest creature. So a lot of the time, it's going to be really nice, and one of the best parts about this card is that it's a land ramp that also protects your life total. So if you play this on turn 3, you're advancing your late game plan, and then you can just totally trade this off with your opponent's attacking creature before the Fenrir sacrifices itself. So it buys you a lot of time by trading off with an opponent creature while ramping you, so that makes it a fantastic card. Next is Torgal, a Fine Hound. So it's a 2-mana 2/2 that can tap for any color. There are a decent number of humans into play, and having them enter with an extra counter on them is also nice. But generally, a 2-mana 2/2 that can tap for a mana of any color is just a great card. Next is Vanille, Cheerful Lycée. So we already talked about the other half of this card that can meld with it. This card's just fantastic on its own. 4 mana 3/2, mill 2, then return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand is just a great upside. And if you do ever meld it, you're going to be really happy as well. But generally, just a great card even on its own. Next is Balam, T-Rexor. So a really giant creature that also has forest cycling for if you can't use it in the early turns of the game, and then you gain 3 life to help you stabilize. It attacks as a huge creature. This is just a great card. Next is Town Greeter. So a really solid 2-mana 1/1 that gets to dig you 4 cards to help you find a land, and if you find a town, you even gain 2 life. So that's just really nice. Perfect for your town deck, and also any deck that cares about maybe filling the graveyard, or just a deck that cares about hitting its land drops, which is pretty much any deck. Next is Clash of the Icons. So if you have a big creature, it's a fight spell. Otherwise, it can mess with sagas. Just a nice card. Next is Colosseum Behemoth. The only reason it's not a great card is because 7 mana is a lot. We've already talked about that being a downside for other cards. Being 7 mana is a lot, but you get a 7 mana 7/7 Trampler that draws you a card or kills something. So hopefully you're going to be killing something because then it has an immediate impact instead of drawing a card, but still just a great card. Next is Diamond Weapon. So again, a very expensive card. It costs 9, but it costs less for each permanent in your graveyard. It's immune to combat damage. This card's going to be a problem, but again, costs a lot of mana. You can only deploy it in the late game. That can be a downside, but it's just a really solid big creature. Next is Gubu Gardener. So it's 2 mana for a 1/3 that taps for a green. Totally solid card. This card has performed well in previous sets when we've seen it as other versions like Druid of the Cowl, and this version is going to be pretty reasonable as well, especially if you have some late game cards you care about ramping out. Next is Grand Pulse Ochu. A 1-mana 1/1 Death Toucher is already just a good card. Death Touch is just such a really good ability, and the fact that you can eventually maybe in the late game buff this up a little bit is just extra upside on a card that's already solid. Next is Ride the Shapoof. It's 2 mana, but it's not going to have an immediate impact on the game, though eventually that 7 mana ability to make it a 7/7 will make it a 7/7 permanently. You don't have to spend that 7 mana over and over, and putting counters on your creatures when lands enter is nice, especially for that red-green landfall deck. Next is Iridia's Return. So it has 2 options. You can either make all of your creatures huge, or you can return 2 permanent cards. A lot of the times, that's just going to be, if the +3/+3 wins you the game, you're going to be happy with that. And as a fallback scenario, the permanent cards can be nice as well. But generally, if you're playing like a green-white deck, you're going to be really happy to have that +3/+3 for your entire team. Next is Saz's Chocobo. So on turn 1, if you play this card, you're going to take over the game because you're eventually going to have like a 1-mana 4/5 or something like that. It's just a huge amount of stats. It's pretty poor top deck in the mid stages of the game, but if you're playing a landfall deck, you'll be saving lands hopefully, and so you'll be able to maybe grow this to be a reasonable size threat eventually. But the fact that it's so good on turn 1 does make it a card that's worth prioritizing. Next is Summon Fat Chocobo. So you get a 5-mana 4/4 that also makes a 2/2. Eventually it'll sacrifice itself, but you'll still be left with that 2/2. So it's a nice little card to have at the top of your curve and gives your stuff trample even and stick around for a while with 4 lore. Next is Quina, Q Gourmet. So we've seen these cards that make Chocobo tokens, and if every time you make a Chocobo, you also make a green frog token, that's fantastic. You can sack the frog to put a counter on Quina, and also there's other tokens like treasure tokens or the job select tokens as well. This card's going to be fantastic in your green-white decks, and just a solid card in any deck that's making some tokens. There is then Side Quest Raise a Chocobo, so it comes into play, makes a Chocobo, and then eventually if you get enough Chocobos into play, you can flip it, and it's another Chocobo that even searches you for a land for that turn, so you'll be able to do a bunch of damage with all of the Chocobos that you have in play, presumably. So a pretty good card, and it's a 2-drop, so it's just a really nice card to have access to. The only reason it's in the solid instead of the great tier is because if you don't have other Chocobo cards in your deck, it's just a 2-mana Chocobo, which is still a reasonable card, but not like at the top of the echelons. Next is Bard's Bow, so 3 mana for a 3/3 reach, totally reasonable. The equip cost is expensive, but the fact that you're going to be getting to these late game scenarios, you're going to want to be using the equipment is really nice. Definitely a solid card. There is Airship Crash. We're moving to the filler cards. This card is just a little bit more niche. You can kill an artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying, so a little bit more narrow. It has cycling though, so you're never going to have a dead card. There's Blitzball Shot. Again, combat trick's not a huge priority, though this one's reasonable. Again, Tifa's Limit Break, a tiered card that's a combat trick, though again, as we said, combat trick's not a huge priority. Then there is Cactuar, which is a really weird card to read. Basically, you play it, and then it sticks in play, and then the next turn, no matter what you do, it's going to come back to your hand pretty much. So you play it, and then the next turn you can attack with it, and then it comes back to your hand. It's just a little bit kind of finicky. You can't really use it to block reliably because eventually it's going to bounce itself to your hand, and that just kind of makes it kind of a bit of a downside. And also, if you're playing in the mid stage of the game where you have enough mana, you don't really care about this card. It's really like only on turn 1 where you eventually get like hit them every other turn. It's a lot of mana invested, not a huge priority. Next is Commune with Beavers. So you get to look at the top 3, look for artifacts, lands, creatures. Not the highest impact card, but one you can play. There is Galoof's Final Act, so a really weird card. So your creature gets buffed, so it can like trade in combat. So it's not really a combat trick because it's still going to die usually. And when it does die, it puts all of its counters. It puts its counters onto another creature. So a really weird card, a little bit finicky, but if you can find a use for it, you can get a huge creature out of the deal. It's just kind of putting all your eggs in one basket and kind of requires a lot of setup. There's Gigantode, so just totally reasonable card. This is filler, but it's like a card you can just put in your deck. 4 mana 4/4 eventually becomes a 6/6. You do just want to have a little bit of ramp in your deck before this card becomes really good, because again, 7 mana, getting 7 lands in play can be tricky. Then there's Loperit Scout. Again, 3 mana 3/2. It gets buffed when creatures enter, so if you make a couple tokens, then you can like attack as a 5/4 sometimes, but just a totally reasonable card, but not like a huge priority ever. Then there's Reach the Horizon. So this is one of those ramp cards that if you're playing a ramp deck, you'll really want this card, and then other decks will have no interest whatsoever, which is why it's in the kind of this filler territory. But being able to search up 2 towns can definitely be pretty nice. There's also Prish's Wandering, so another way to get basic lands or towns into play, and you can get a stats buff. But again, some decks don't really care about ramp, which is why this is in the filler category. Moving on to the gold multicolored cards. Black Waltz number 3. It's like a double one of these wizards. So when you cast a non-creature, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. It's a flying death touch for 4 mana. This one's great. There's also Garland, Knight of Cornelia, so it's a 2 mana 3/2, so already good. When you cast a non-creature, you surveil one, so it can help you find more non-creatures, and then if it does eventually die, you can return it from the graveyard to the battlefield as a giant 5/5 flyer to help you end the game. So this card's perfect for the black-red deck. Next is Titus, Blitzball Star. So you get a 3 mana 2/1. When an artifact enters, you get a counter on Titus, and then when it attacks, you tap a creature. So this guy just takes over the game. It makes it really hard for your opponent to deal with, and if you're playing like artifacts as you curve out, you're just going to win the game with Titus. Next is Sid, Timeless Artificer. There's a bunch of different artworks for this card, which is pretty cool. But basically, artifact creatures and heroes get +1/+1 for each artificer you control. So that counts Sid. So basically, it's an anthem for any of your artifact creatures and heroes. So if you have any of those job select cards, then those are heroes and any artifact creature. So basically, in the blue-white deck, a lot of your cards are going to get +1/+1. And it's a 4 mana 4/4 that can cycle if you can't use it. So just a really nice card. And if you have multiple Sids, then you can cycle them into your graveyard, and then the other Sids are going to care about that one as well. So artifact creatures and heroes get +1 for each artifact you control and artificer in your graveyard. So that's just really nice to have. So if you have 2 Sids and one's in the graveyard, one's in play, then all your stuff is going to get +2/+2. Well, not all your stuff, all your artifact creatures and heroes, but as we already discussed, really nice card. Next is Lock Coal. So it's 3 mana for a 2/3 Death Touch lifelink, really solid, and then it loots if it deals damage to a player. Just totally solid card, and in your black-blue decks, it's going to be a real priority for you. Next is Ultimecia, Time Sorceress. So 5 mana 4/5. Enters, Surveil 2, attacks, Surveil 2, and if you get 8 cards in your graveyard and 8 mana, you basically win the game because it flips into a 7/7 menace that gives you an extra turn. So you get to hit your opponent for 7 and then take an extra turn and hit your opponent for 7. So that's just pretty good because the way the transform works is you don't it doesn't exile and then coming back and play, it just flips over. So That's just be worth noting. Some of the transform cards exile and come back into play. Some of the transforms just flip over, and so just keep that in mind when you are making those decisions. Next is the Emperor of Palamecia. So it's 2 mana 2/2 that can then help you cast your non-creature spells. So it can go turn 2 into immediately start casting your big spells. And when you're casting your big spells, it's going to get counters. Eventually, it's going to flip into the Lord Master of Hell, and then just attack your opponent and deal X to them, X to the number of non-creature, non-land cards in your graveyard. And so that's going to be quite a bit of damage when this thing attacks. Even as a 3/3, it'll attack and then deal like 4 or 5 damage to your opponent, which is just a huge amount of damage. Next is Rinoa Heartily. So 5 mana 4/4. It enters, creates the little 1/1 dog. So nice little 2 bodies for 1 card. And then when it attacks, another creature gets just giant if you have a few creatures in play. There is then Zidane, Tantalus Thief. So 5 mana 3/3, not the best stats, but you get to steal one of your opponent's creatures, give it lifelink and haste, so then you hit your opponent with it. And then when you give the creature back to your opponent, you're going to get a treasure token, which is always nice to have. There is Rufus Shinra. So 3 mana 2/4, perfect for the sacrifice decks, because when it attacks, if you don't control Darkstar the dog, you get to make Darkstar the dog, and then you can sacrifice Darkstar the dog to something else if you have a sacrifice effect, and then eventually make it again by attacking again with Rufus. So kind of a cool little synergy for your black-white deck. Then they're moving on to the solid cards. There's Judge, which is another black-white card. Whenever another creature or artifact you control dies, you get a counter on Judge. So it doesn't have any abilities to enable sacrifice, but it works really well with sacrifice. It's got kind of a Stormtrooper helmet going on, and it has Menace, so it's a nice little big attacker. I just threw the Stormtrooper comment in there randomly. Next is Cloud of Darkness. So it's a black-green card. It's a nice little value play. When it enters, you can kill a small creature an opponent controls, though if you get to the late game and you really fill your graveyard, you can kill something bigger. It's just the fact that it's a little bit unreliable based on how big your graveyard is why it isn't quite just already a best category, but the fact that you can use this to kill creatures is really definitely nice. Next is X-Death, Void Warlock. So 3 mana 3/3, gains 3 life, and then if you have a big filled graveyard, you get to flip it into a giant creature, though the fact that it still has 3 toughness is a bit of a downside, but the fact that it has trample means that it can oftentimes hit your opponent and trample over and cause some real problems. Next is Garnet, Princess of Alexandria. Really nice creature. Comes into play on turn 2 as a life linker, and then you can remove lore counters to make it bigger. So you play like this, and then you play one of the sagas, and then it just gets to stay a creature for much longer because your Garnet's going to be removing those lore counters from it. And you're going to be able to grow Garnet in the process. So a really nice card, though there aren't as many sagas, which is why it isn't just one of the best category. Next is Giot, King of the Dwarves. So it's a 2 mana 1/1 double strike. So wears equipment very well because of double strike. And then when it or another dwarf or equipment enters, you get to discard a card and then draw a card. So it helps you kind of sort through, get rid of extra lands you don't need, and things like that. So a really good card for your red-white equipment deck. Then there's Gladiolus, Amicitia. So the giant creature comes into play, gets you a land, so it triggers all your landfall immediately, gives a landfall creature gives another creature +2/+2 and trample whenever lands come in, so it triggers that immediately. Really nice card. It's just because it costs 6 mana, it does get a little bit of a knock, but and it isn't quite in the best category, but it's still a really good card. And it's even a card that you can use to splash, because like if you're playing this in like a blue, green, red deck, then you can search for any land card. So you could like use it to splash a blue card or something like that if you wanted to. Next is Rydia, Summoner of Mist. So another landfall card, lets you discard a draw card, so it gets you some nice filtering, and then eventually can return sagas from your graveyard. So if you have some sagas, that's a nice upside to have as well. There is Ignis Scienta, so it lets you get a land from your top 6 into play, so it helps you ramp, and then eventually lets you exile cards from a graveyard, so that can be yours or your opponent's, and eventually get some food tokens if you're exiling creatures. So that's a nice little card to have. Definitely a solid option for your blue-green ramp decks. Next is Omega, Heartless Evolution. So a really nice top-end card. If you have a bunch of different non-basic lands in play, if you're playing a bunch of the towns, then you're going to be able to get this card to gain you a bunch of life, stun one of your opponent's creatures for a while. It is just a giant 7 mana 8/8, and doesn't like get you a card like huge amount of card advantage. The stun can be kind of like a card, but that's the only reason it's not worth a little bit higher priority. Next is Shantoto, Tactician Magician. So it works really well in the big spell deck. You're going to be drawing extra cards, which is going to find you more big spells, and that's just exactly what you're looking for. Though it is a 0/4, it doesn't really block the best without those big spells, which is why it isn't at the best category. Moving on to the colorless cards. Relentless X-ATM 092, giant creature, hard to block, comes back eventually, but it is 6 mana and doesn't like have the 8 mana is a lot to bring it back, and it's a 6 mana 6/5, so that's the only reason it's a little bit lower. There is World Map, so 1 mana, then you can use another mana to search for a basic land card. Decent fixing, can even search for more specialty lands if you're willing to spend 3 mana, so gets a little bit more value in the late game when this would normally fall off completely, but still not a crazy card, just a solid fixer. Next is Blitzball, so 3 mana, add a mana of any color. You can eventually sacrifice it. It does get a little bit better if you have legendary creatures to be able to sacrifice it more reliably, because turning your mana into card draw later on is really powerful, but it's a little bit harder to enable that. Next is Adventurer's Airship. So 3 mana 3/2 flyer vehicle with crew 2 is a little bit hard to use, though the looting is definitely nice. Then there is Instant Ramen. So a nice card for the artifacts deck because it's an artifact that comes into play, can trigger things at instant speed, draws you a card to replace itself. You can sacrifice it to sacrifice effects for black-white, things like that. But generally just a little bit more of a grease the wheels type card than a powerful card. Then there's Iron Giant, so just big creature, kind of just totally filler. If you need a giant creature for your ramp deck, you can play this. It's just not particularly great. Vigilance is really nice on these big creatures. Reach is nice, but it's nothing special. Then there's Lionheart, so it's a bit expensive, 4 mana to deal 2 to something, but if you are in an equipment deck and you can use this thing to like make your creatures better, you have equipment synergies, the card does get better. Being able to kill something or even deal damage to the opponent is a thing you can use on your equipment. It's just +2/+1, and having to spend 4 mana to get this into play is a bit expensive. Then there's Lunatic Pandora. Again, 1 mana, you play this, eventually you start surveilling with it, and then you can like sacrifice it to destroy an online permanent. It gives you interaction if you really need it, but it's a very expensive way to do that and a very expensive way to give you card selection. Can it be a card you play in your artifacts for a synergy piece, but sometimes you'll play it in your decks that just need any interaction at all, but generally not a great card. Then there's Magic Pot, 3 mana, 1/4. If it dies, you get a treasure, and you can use it as graveyard hate. It's more of a sideboard card than anything, but if you're really defensive or you need some artifact synergies, you can use it, but not a huge priority. And then there's Monk's Fist. We already looked at this card a little bit, but basically a 2 mana 2/1 that you can eventually spend 2 to equip and give something +1/+0 isn't the craziest card. Then there's Ring of the Lucy, so 4 mana, then you can use it as a ramp piece. So if you have a ramp deck that's like trying to ramp into stuff, you can definitely find good uses for this. It's just the secondary mode of 2 mana tap, pay 1 life to tap permanent. It's a bit expensive, and also like the life does add up. So like normally this would like win you a board stall, but if you're losing a life every time, then it kind of does negate the purpose of being in a board stall because you will slowly lose the game if you're trying to use this to stabilize. Though being able to ramp from 4 to 7 can be good in the right situation. It's just a bit more of a niche card. And then we have the Build Around Poo Poo UFO. Papa? I have no idea how to pronounce that. But yeah, it's a 2 mana 0/4 flyer, so not the greatest stat line. 0 power is always a liability. And you can put lands into play, so if you have a lot of card draw, so you can turn your card draw into ramp, which can be useful. And then eventually, if you have a lot of towns, you can make this a creature. You want to reliably be able to turn this into like a 3/4 creature in the late game. So if you have like 4 or 5 towns, maybe 6 towns in your deck, this card becomes a little bit better because being able to make a 3/4 flyer can be relevant. But generally, the fact that you don't get the power boost for a while is kind of going to be kind of a liability on your UFO. Then we have the bad card, Elixir. So 1 mana, it enters tapped, so you can't even use it right away. And you have to 5 mana, exile it, shuffle all non-land cards into your library, and gain some life. So it's just a pure life gain spell, pure recycle effect. Not really something you're going to be particularly interested in limited. It puts you down a card and doesn't get you enough compensation. Then we're moving on to the lands. There are 10 different tap lands. That's why there's a ×10 here. The blue-green one is the best one because it's a town, and the blue-green deck is the deck that cares the most about towns. Though in your towns deck, you can play, if you have enough synergy pieces, like the half-on color one. So if you're playing a blue-green towns deck, you could play like a red-green town without even splashing red just to get the extra town if you felt like you really needed it. But the towns are going to be nice fixers, and they're going to be good to have to make your deck run more smoothly, especially if you have a town payoff. Then there is the Capital City, which is another town that you're going to be pretty happy to play in most decks. It filters your draw, so you're going to be more happy playing this in decks that are trying to fix their mana, trying to splash something, and the cycling is nice upside as well. So if you have those cards that search up towns in the late game, you can search this one up and then cycle it away maybe. So that's a nice little upside to have. There's also Crossroads Village, comes into play tapped and chooses a color, and you can add a mana of the chosen color, so that's really nice for fixing your mana and also even for splashing, giving you an extra source of all of the colors you need. Then there's the build around towns. So these are the ones you won't play normally, but if you have enough town payoffs, they can be worth doing because playing a colorless land is a huge cost. But if you have a card that like really rewards you for having towns, then you might play something like Adventurer's Inn, which gains you 2 life, taps for colorless. Though remember, tapping for colorless is a big downside. There's also Eden, Seed of the Sanctum. So again, it's a town that taps for colorless, though it does have some late game utility. So in these decks that really care about towns, having one of these might not be the end of the world. And similarly, the Gold Saucer. So if you really care about towns, you can eventually like flip coins and sack some artifacts to draw some cards. But generally, you're going to want to be just playing your normal mana base so you can actually make sure you cast all of your spells. But if you have some town payoffs or some real reason to want to be able to sacrifice 2 artifacts to draw a card, then maybe you can consider playing this card. But generally, you're not going to want to be investing all this mana into this effect anyway. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the limited set review. If you made it to the end, leave #FantasyPrep in the comments section down below. But that's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.